I should have worn gloves. That was my first thought as I looked down at my hands, resting against the pristine white tablecloth. The linen was imported, Italian, probably costing more per yard than my entire work wardrobe. And there were my hands clean, scrubbed raw in the hotel bathroom just 20 minutes ago, but still bearing the faint, stubborn shadows of grease under the nails and a fresh, jagged scratch across my thumb from a solar panel bracket. They were working hands. Builders' hands. And in this dining room in Georgetown, surrounded by the political elite of Washington, D.C., they looked like an act of war. The room smelled of roasted duck and old money. Crystal glasses clinked, a delicate, fragile sound that grated against my nerves. At the head of the table stood my father, David. He was in his element, holding a glass of champagne like a scepter, his face flushed with the kind of self-importance that only comes from decades of proximity to power without ever actually wielding it. He tapped a silver spoon against his glass. The room fell silent. 30 faces turned toward him, senators' aides, lobbyists, power brokers. And me. To my son, Tyler, my father boomed, his voice projecting as if he were on the Senate floor, a man who understands the weight of legacy, a man who knows that power isn't just about what you do, but who you know. He beamed at Tyler, my older brother, who sat preening in his tailored suit, soaking up the adulation like a lizard on a rock. Tyler has secured a position that will shape policy for the next generation. He is the future of this family. Applause rippled through the room. Polite, restrained, expensive applause. I clapped too, a slow, mechanical rhythm. Then, my father's gaze shifted. It didn't land on me warmly. It snagged on me, like a piece of silk catching on a nail. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. And, he continued, his voice dropping an octave, performatively solemn, I suppose we must also welcome my daughter, Alexandra. We must apologize for her appearance tonight. He gestured vaguely toward me, as if I were a stain on the upholstery. Alexandra works in construction. Manual labor. She likes to play in the dirt while the adults run the world. But we love her anyway, don't we? A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, condescending. The woman next to me, a lobbyist with pearls the size of grapes, shifted her chair slightly away, as if poverty might be contagious. My mother, Natalie, let out a tinkling, nervous laugh, covering her mouth with a napkin to hide her grimace. Tyler smirked, raising his glass in a mock salute. To playing in the dirt, Allie, he mouthed. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I didn't pull my hands off the table to hide them. I just sat there, feeling the heat of the humiliation wash over me, and then, just as quickly, recede, leaving behind something cold and hard. It was clarity. For years, I had wondered what it would take to finally sever the cord, to finally stop hoping they would see me. And in that moment, as my father apologized for my existence to a room full of strangers, I realized the price of admission to this family was my dignity, and I was done paying it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't storm out. I didn't throw my drink in his face. I didn't even frown. I simply picked up my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and placed it back on my lap. The laughter around the table was dying down, replaced by the murmuring of side conversations, the scraping of silver against china. My father was already turning away, dismissing me as he would a waiter who had brought the wrong order. He was busy charming the senator's aide to his right, his hand resting casually on the shoulder of his expensive suit jacket. A jacket I paid for. The thought didn't come with anger. It came with the cool, detached precision of an accountant spotting a rounding error. I looked around the room, really looked at it. The baccarat crystal chandelier, the fresh orchids flown in from Hawaii, the vintage Bordeaux breathing in the decanter. It was a beautiful scene. A perfect tableau of D.C. power and influence. And it was all a hologram, a projection funded by a single, silent stream of capital that flowed from a bank account in Austin, Texas, directly into the hollow shell of the Sterling Foundation. I slipped my hand into my purse, resting it on my phone. The metal was cool against my skin. Under the tablecloth, shielded by the heavy drape of the linen, I unlocked the screen. The blue light washed over my palm, invisible to everyone else. I opened my banking app. Face ID recognized me instantly, granting access to the reality my family refused to see. I scrolled past the business accounts, past the infrastructure holdings, past the liquidity funds for the new solar grid project in Nevada. I found the personal transfer list. There it was, scheduled for the 1st of every month. A recurring wire transfer labeled simply, Anonymous Grant, Sterling Foundation Operating Fund. I stared at the number. $50,000. Every single month. $600,000 a year. Enough to keep the lights on in this brownstone. To pay the mortgage my father pretended didn't exist. To fund Tyler's consulting trips to Europe. I had set it up 3 years ago, burying the transaction through 3 shell companies so they would never know their safety net was woven by the daughter they were ashamed of. I had told myself it was charity. I had told myself it was duty. Now, I realized it was a subscription fee for a service I wasn't even receiving. I tapped the line item. A menu popped up. Edit. Skip. Cancel. My thumb hovered over cancel. I looked up at my mother across the table. She was picking at her salad, looking at me with that familiar mix of pity and annoyance. "Try not to sulk, Alexandra," she mouthed, winking at the woman next to her. "It's a party." I didn't blink. I looked back down at the screen. I pressed cancel. A confirmation box appeared. "Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer? This action cannot be undone." I pressed yes. The screen refreshed. Transfer cancelled. It was done. No fireworks, no thunderclap, just a silent digital severance. The notification vanished, and with it, the foundation of their entire lives. I locked the phone and slid it back into my purse. I reached for my wine glass, the stem delicate between my calloused fingers. I took a slow sip. The wine was excellent. Full-bodied, complex, expensive. I savored it, letting the taste linger on my tongue. It was the last thing they would ever get from me. I wasn't always this cold. 5 years ago, I was just Alexandra, the manual labor mistake who dropped out of Georgetown Law because I realized I didn't want to argue about the world I wanted to build it. I remember the day I left. My father stood in the foyer of the brownstone, the same foyer where he'd just welcomed tonight's guests, and told me that if I walked out that door, I was walking out on my legacy. "You're trading influence for irrelevance," he'd sneered. "Have fun playing in the dirt." So I did. I moved to Austin, Texas, with $3,000 and a terrifying amount of ambition. I traded pantsuits for steel-toed boots and political galas for 110-degree days on dusty construction sites. I founded EcoGrid with nothing but a laptop and a stubborn belief that America's energy infrastructure was broken and I could fix it. Those first 2 years were brutal. I lived in a trailer on my first job site because I couldn't afford rent. I learned to read blueprints by flashlight and negotiate contracts with men who thought I was the secretary. I ate dust, literally and metaphorically. But while my family was busy sipping cocktails and trading favors in D.C., I was laying the foundation of a new power grid. It turns out, playing in the dirt is profitable if you know what you're building. EcoGrid exploded. We weren't just building solar fields, we were redesigning how cities consumed energy. By year 3, we had contracts with 3 major municipalities. By year 4, we were the primary infrastructure partner for the state of Texas. And last month, our Series C valuation hit $410 million. I wasn't just a builder anymore. I was a titan. But my family didn't know that. To them, I was still the failure, the disappointment. And in a twisted way, I wanted to keep it that way. I wanted their love to be real, not transactional. I wanted them to care about me, not my net worth. So, 3 years ago, when I heard through the grapevine that the Sterling Foundation, the nonprofit that gave my parents their social standing and political leverage, was on the brink of bankruptcy due to my father's mismanagement, I made a choice. I didn't let them fail. I didn't let them lose the brownstone or the prestige they valued more than their own children. I set up a blind trust. I became their anonymous donor. I told myself it was noble. I told myself I was being the bigger person. But looking back, I realize it was something far more pathetic. I was buying a subscription to a family that didn't want me. I was paying for the privilege of being their daughter, hoping that if I just kept the lights on long enough, they might eventually look up and see who was flipping the switch. Tonight, sitting at this table, listening to my father mock the very hands that signed his checks, the illusion finally shattered. I wasn't their savior. I was their mark. And the saddest part wasn't that they were using me, it was that I had let them. You might ask why I stayed, why I paid, why a woman who could negotiate multi-million-dollar infrastructure contracts with the state of Texas couldn't tell her own father no when it came to a monthly wire transfer. It's a fair question. The answer isn't love. It isn't even duty. It's conditioning. Psychologists call it the invisible chain of the survivor. It's that phantom tether that keeps you circling the people who hurt you, waiting for the one moment of validation that will make the years of dismissal make sense. I wasn't just funding the Sterling Foundation. I was paying a retainer fee for the hope that one day my father would look at me with the same pride he reserved for Tyler. I treated their approval like a project I could engineer. If I just provided enough capital, if I just stabilized their chaotic finances, if I just polished the bars of the cage bright enough, they would finally invite me inside. I was the architect of my own prison. I convinced myself that my anonymity was a power move, a way to test their love. Would they love me without the money? But deep down, I knew the answer. I was hiding my success because I was terrified that if they knew I didn't need them, they would have no use for me at all. For 3 years, I lived a double life. In Austin, I was A.R. Sterling, the woman who turned sunlight into electricity. I wore hard hats and commanded job sites. I was decisive, respected, and formidable. But the moment I crossed the state line into D.C., I shrank. I put on the role of the disappointment like an old, ill-fitting coat. I let them interrupt me. I let them critique my clothes. I let them sneer at my little construction job. I did it because the chain was wrapped so tight around my throat I didn't even feel it anymore. It was just the way I breathed. But tonight, when my father apologized to his guests for my presence, something snapped. It wasn't a loud break. It was the quiet, metallic click of a lock disengaging. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see a patriarch or a titan of industry. I saw a man in a suit I bought, drinking wine I paid for, leveraging a reputation I was subsidizing. He wasn't the giant. I was. The cognitive dissonance cleared. I realized I hadn't been paying for their survival. I had been paying for my own abuse. I had handed them the whip every single month and thanked them for the privilege. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive lilies and old money. The air tasted different now. It tasted like oxygen. I wasn't waiting for permission to leave anymore. I was just waiting for the check to clear, or in this case, for the cancellation to hit. The chain was on the floor. And I was the only one at the table who knew I was free. The dinner continued, oblivious to the financial earthquake I had just triggered. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Politics, galas, who was summering where. Tyler was holding court, telling a story about a disaster of a meeting he'd had with a senator who didn't understand the nuance of leverage. It's like talking to a brick wall, Tyler laughed, swirling his cognac. Some people just don't have the capacity for high-level strategy. My mother, Natalie, leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light. Well, darling, that's why you're indispensable. Not everyone has your gift for navigating complexity. She glanced at me then, her expression tightening. Unlike some of us, who prefer simpler tasks. Alexandra, dear, I hope you remembered to wash your hands properly. I swear I can still see grease on your thumb. The table chuckled. It was a reflex, a social habit. I looked at my thumb. The scratch was still there, a thin red line. It's not grease, Mother, I said, my voice level. It's a cut, from a bracket. A bracket, Tyler snorted. Listen to her. She sounds like she's building a erector set. Actually, I said, I'm building the power grid for the entire western seaboard. They stared at me. For a second, just a second, the truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. But then, the cognitive dissonance kicked in. I watched it happen in real time. My father blinked, his brain rejecting the data that contradicted his worldview. My mother's smile faltered, then reset, like a glitching screen. Oh, Alexandra, she sighed, shaking her head. Always so dramatic. I'm sure your little solar project is very sweet. Sweet, I repeated. $410 million isn't sweet, Mother. It's a valuation. My father laughed. It was a loud, booming sound, meant to drown out the absurdity of my statement. 400 million. Did you hear that, everyone? My daughter has an active imagination. Perhaps she should write fiction instead of playing with construction equipment. They couldn't see it. They physically couldn't see it. Psychologists call it the scapegoat mechanism. The family needs a failure to define their own success. If I wasn't the failure, then Tyler wasn't the golden child, and my father wasn't the patriarch. If I was the titan, then they were just expensive pets. Their egos protected them from reality like a blast shield. I'm not imagining anything, I said, leaning back in my chair. But since we're talking about finances, Tyler, how is the consulting firm doing? Still waiting on that big contract? Tyler stiffened. These things take time, Ali. You wouldn't understand. High-level negotiations aren't like digging ditches. No. I agreed. Digging ditches actually produces something. The air in the room changed. The guests shifted, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. My father's smile vanished. That's enough, Alexandra. You are a guest at this table. Act like one. A guest? I mused. That's an interesting word for the person paying the mortgage. My mother dropped her fork. It clattered against the china, a sharp, violent sound in the hushed room. I said. I looked directly at my father. Enjoy the wine, Dad. It's the last bottle I'm buying. They stared at me, confusion warring with outrage. They still didn't get it. They thought I was being rude. They didn't realize I was being literal. The blindness of the elite is a fascinating thing. They are so accustomed to the light staying on, they never think to look for the generator. But the generator just quit, and it was about to get very dark in here. The tension in the room was brittle, ready to snap, when the double doors at the far end of the dining room swung open. The sound was heavy, final, breaking the suffocating silence. Heads turned. Jessica stood in the doorway. Jessica, Tyler's fiancée, looked nothing like the composed DC socialite she usually portrayed. Her hair was slightly askew, her cheeks flushed, and she was clutching her phone like a lifeline. She was still wearing her coat, breathless, as if she had run all the way from K Street. Jessica! Tyler stood up, his face transforming from annoyance to relief. Finally! We were starting to worry. The toast is over, but quiet, Tyler, Jessica said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a siren. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at my parents. She was looking at me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and awe. She walked slowly toward the table, ignoring the confused murmurs of the guests. She stopped directly across from me, her hands gripping the back of an empty chair. I just got off the phone with the board, she said, her voice trembling. The Texas grid deal is stalled. Indefinitely, my father scoffed, annoyed at the interruption of his dinner party. Jessica, darling, we are in the middle of a celebration. Business can wait. No, David, it can't, Jessica snapped, her gaze never leaving mine. Because the person holding up the deal, the person who owns the proprietary technology we need to move forward, the person who just red-flagged our environmental compliance report, is sitting at this table. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the wine fridge in the pantry. What are you talking about? My mother asked, her voice shrill. Alexandra works in construction. Construction? Jessica let out a short, hysterical laugh. She pointed a shaking finger at me. Do you know who this is? This isn't just your daughter. This is A.R. Sterling. My father frowned. Who? A.R. Sterling, Jessica repeated, emphasizing each syllable. The founder of EcoGrid. The woman who built the Nevada solar array. The woman who personally negotiated the infrastructure contract for the entire state of Texas last year. She's not a construction worker, David. She's the titan who is currently deciding whether my firm survives the quarter. The cognitive dissonance in the room shattered. I watched it happen. My father's face went slack. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Tyler looked between Jessica and me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. That's impossible, Tyler stammered. Ollie dropped out. She lives in a trailer. I lived in a trailer for 6 months, I said, my voice calm, filling the silence. 4 years ago. While I was building the first grid. Now I live in the penthouse of the building I own in downtown Austin. I looked at Jessica. I saw the compliance report. Jess, your firm missed the groundwater impact study. Fix it, and I'll sign off on Monday. But not a moment before. Yes, Jessica breathed, nodding rapidly. Yes, Miss Sterling. Thank you. I'll handle it immediately. Miss Sterling, my father whispered. The name tasted foreign in his mouth. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And for the first time in his life, he didn't see his daughter. He saw power, and he was terrified. The shift was violent. The air in the room didn't just change, it inverted. 5 minutes ago, I was the embarrassment. Now, I was the most dangerous person in the room. The guests were staring at me with naked hunger. The senator's aide was already reaching for his phone, probably to Google A.R. Sterling. I took another sip of wine. You were saying something about manual labor, Dad? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The hierarchy had flipped, and we all knew it. The Trojan horse hadn't just entered the gates. She had burned the city down from the inside. My father laughed. It was a weak, fluttering sound, like a bird trapped in a chimney. Well, he said, smoothing his tie, trying to recapture the gravitas he had lost moments ago. That's quite a revelation, Alexandra. 400 million. Very impressive. We should have known you were up to something grand. He turned to the guests, his smile tight. See? I told you she was special. A Sterling through and through. Building empires runs in the blood. Stop, I said. It wasn't a shout, but it cut him off instantly. Don't do that. Don't rewrite history. 5 minutes ago, I was a manual labor mistake. Now I'm a Sterling. We're family, my mother interjected, her voice trembling. Of course we're proud. We just didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't look, I countered. But you knew about the money. What money? Tyler asked, confused. The Sterling Foundation, I said. The non-profit that pays for this house. That pays for your lifestyle, Tyler. The foundation that was bankrupt 3 years ago until an anonymous donor stepped in. My father went pale. It was a wire transfer, I corrected. From my personal account. $50,000 a month. For 36 months. Do the math. A gasp went around the room. Jessica looked at me with horror. You funded them? You paid for all of this? I thought I was saving them, I said, looking at my parents. I thought if I kept you afloat, you'd eventually find your footing. But you didn't. You embezzled it. That's a lie, my father shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Is it? I pulled my phone back out. I have the audit report right here. You used charity funds to pay the mortgage on this brownstone. You used it to pay off Tyler's gambling debts in Vegas last year. You used it to buy the car sitting in the driveway. That's not just unethical. Dad, that's fraud. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Fraud. I didn't know, my mother whispered. David told me the investments were paying off. He lied to you too, Mother, I said. But you let him, because the lie was comfortable. The truth that your daughter was the only reason you weren't on the street was too painful to accept. This is the illusion of power of the empty wallet. They had built their entire identity on having the house, the status, the connections. But they were nothing. Their power was a rental, leased with my money. And the lease was up. I canceled the transfer tonight, I said, my voice final. The money is gone. The foundation is insolvent, and the authorities will likely be auditing the books by Monday. My father slumped into his chair, a deflated balloon. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified realization of a man who has been exposed. Alexandra, please, he rasped. You can't do this. We'll lose everything. You already lost everything, I said. You lost your integrity. You lost your dignity. And worst of all, you lost your daughter. I stood up. I smoothed my dress. I looked at Jessica. I'll see you on Monday, Jessica. Bring the revised compliance report. I will, she said, her voice filled with respect. I walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back at the table, at the crystal, at the people who had claimed to love me only when they thought I was useful. I walked out the front door of the brownstone, down the steps I used to scrub, and into the cool night air. The silence of the street was beautiful. It wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that I didn't have to buy. I hailed a cab. Where to? The driver asked. The airport, I said. I have a city to build. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't have to. Silence is a language my family understands perfectly, especially when there is no longer a wire transfer attached to the conversation. I left D.C. that night and flew back to Austin on a red-eye. I watched the sun rise from 30,000 feet, painting the clouds in shades of gold and violet. It looked like a blueprint for a new world. The fallout was quiet, predictable, and absolute. Gravity did the rest. Without my monthly grant, the Sterling Foundation was insolvent within 60 days. The auditors found the embezzlement, of course. My father managed to avoid jail time barely by liquidating his assets and pleading ignorance, a humiliation that hurt him far more than a prison sentence ever would. The brownstone in Georgetown, the symbol of their status, was sold quietly to a tech lobbyist to cover the debts. My parents moved to a small condo in Virginia. I hear my mother tells people they downsized for retirement. They still lie, but now, the lies don't cost me a cent. Tyler's consulting firm folded when the Texas grid deal fell through. Without the prestige of the family name backed by my money, his high-level strategy turned out to be nothing more than hot air. He sends me an email once a year on my birthday. I don't open them. I just archive them, a digital record of a brother I used to know. Jessica, however, surprised me. She left Tyler 3 months after that dinner. She kept her job, fixed the compliance report, and is now one of EcoGrid's most reliable partners. We aren't friends that would be too complicated, but we are colleagues. And in the world I built, competence is the only currency that matters. I stood on the roof of the new EcoGrid headquarters this morning. It was early, the air already thick with the heat of the Texas summer. Below me, the city was waking up. I could see the steel skeleton of our new solar array stretching out into the desert, thousands of panels tilting in unison to catch the light. My father called this playing in the dirt. He meant it as an insult. He meant that I was beneath him because I created things with my hands instead of manipulating them with my words. But standing there, feeling the hum of the grid I built, I realized he was right. I do play in the dirt. Dirt is where foundations are laid. Dirt is where you plant the seeds of the future. Dirt is real. I adjusted my hard hat and checked the time. My team was waiting. I didn't need a toast in a Georgetown dining room to know who I was. I didn't need their approval to know I had value. I was the architect of my own life. I had designed a structure that could withstand the weight of their rejection, and I had built it strong enough to stand on its own. They built a house of cards. I built a power plant. And the lights are never going out again. Have you ever had to build your own life while everyone else doubted the blueprints? Have you ever been the one playing in the dirt while everyone else pretended to be clean? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, hit subscribe. We're building something real here, and I want you to be a part of it.